Stand anywhere in this country, and the ocean is on both sides of you at once. Nowhere is higher than a 2-story house. Around 11,000 people live here, on 9 specks of coral halfway between Hawaii and Australia. And every year the sea climbs a little further up their doorsteps. This is Tuvalu. The land is losing. They know exactly what's coming, and they're staying anyway. A strip of sand in the middle of the ocean. Tuvalu's total land area is only about 26 square kilometers, making it smaller than the footprint of many international airports. To put that in context, you could fit the entire country inside Berlin's city limits more than 10 times over. The average elevation across all the islands sits at roughly 2 meters above sea level, which means that in most places you're standing barely above the tide line itself. And the highest point in the entire country, a spot on the tiny island of New Lakita, reaches only about 4.6 meters. That's it. There is no mountain, no hill, no high ground to retreat to. When the sea rises, there is quite literally nowhere higher to go. That land consists of 9 islands, 6 atolls, and 3 reef islands, scattered across hundreds of kilometers of open water. They were formed over millions of years through a process that reads like slow geological theater. Undersea volcanoes rose from the ocean floor, and coral reefs grew in living rings around their slopes, building layer after layer of calcium skeleton in the warm shallows. Then the volcanoes began to sink, slowly, inevitably, until only the coral rings remained, hovering at the surface like the outlines of mountains that no longer exist. If you picture a volcano drowning in slow motion while its coral necklace stays afloat, you have the basic shape of Tuvalu. You'll notice that every grain of sand underfoot is broken down coral, not rock, which is why the soil remains so poor and thin, supporting only coconut, breadfruit, pandanus, and pulaka. A handful of crops that have learned to tolerate what almost nothing else can. But here's where the picture shifts. While its land is minuscule, the ocean Tuvalu governs covers nearly 900,000 square kilometers, a stretch of Pacific larger than France and Germany combined. Not just a tiny island nation, one of the most water-dominant territories on Earth, a country that is, by almost any measure, far more sea than land. On a map, it is almost invisible, a scattering of dots you could miss entirely. Beneath the surface, it is enormous. The distinction between atolls and reef islands matters more than you might think. An atoll encloses a lagoon, a calm, shallow body of water sheltered from the open ocean, where fish gather and children learn to swim. The 3 reef islands, by contrast, sit directly on reef platforms with no lagoon at all, facing the open sea on every side. If you live on one of those 3, your relationship with the Pacific is more direct, more exposed, and considerably less forgiving. And here is the paradox that sits at the heart of everything you're about to see. The very same process that gave Tuvalu its beauty, the coral, the lagoons, the low bright rings of sand, is exactly what makes it the most vulnerable nation on the planet. The thing that built it is the thing that dooms it. Keep that in mind, because it is the foundation the entire story rests on. And yet, on this narrow strip of borrowed coral, an entire culture took root. Before we get to what that culture looks like up close, I'm genuinely curious where in the world you're watching this from right now. Drop your country in the comments below. I want to see just how far this little chain of islands is reaching tonight. The house with no walls. At the center of community life sits the pulaka, an open-sided meeting house where decisions are made by consensus. With no podium separating speaker from audience, if you visit one in the evening, you'll find elders and younger men sitting on woven mats, voices rising and falling, sometimes for hours, until everyone has spoken and a rough agreement settles over the room. There is no gavel, no majority overriding a minority. Just patience. It works because everyone shares the same stakes on the same narrow strip of coral, and a decision made together, however long it takes, is one that actually holds. Compare that to most parliamentary systems where a slim majority can push through almost anything over the objections of half the room. Tuvaluans trust their way for a reason. Between meetings, daily life fills itself with tradition. Fatele, which combines dance and song with a wooden box drum, preserves island history one performance at a time. Each song carries a story. A voyage, a chief's deed, a storm survived, and the dancers move in synchronized rows while the drum keeps time with a resonance you can feel in your chest before you hear it. The performances build so gradually you don't notice your own pulse rising until a song ends and the silence hits. Women hand-weave flower garlands that are worn daily, not just at festivals. They are simply part of how people present themselves. If you walk through the market in the morning, you'll notice nearly every woman wearing one, fresh that day, the scent of frangipani mixing with the salt air. The garlands are not decoration the way a brooch is. They are closer to a daily gesture, an act of care for the community that sees you. And when people want to play, they take to the airport runway, where kilakiti, a Polynesian variant of cricket, and tano unfold on the tarmac. Because in a country this small, the runway is about the only flat stretch of ground large enough for a proper game. Kilakiti teams can be large, sometimes around 20 on a side, and the bats are heavy paddles that send the ball past boundary markers made of whatever flip-flops are on hand. But the ocean that surrounds all this does more than feed people and shape the landscape. It also serves as the country's most reliable prison wall. Tuvalu has one small detention facility, and it functions as an open prison because the simple fact is that there is nowhere to run. Inmates can leave to work during the day and simply return, since beyond the reef there is nothing but open water stretching hundreds of kilometers in every direction. Fences, in this context, are almost comically beside the point. The sea is the fence. Now stop and think about that for a second. A prison with no walls, where nobody escapes because the ocean does the guarding. If that strikes you as completely insane, comment the number 2 down below. And keep watching, because in the very next chapter there's a scene that plays out on that same runway. A siren, a whole town scattering, and then something almost no other country on Earth would ever allow. And you're going to want to see how it ends. The runway is the town square. The runway at Funafuti International Airport. You'll sometimes see it listed under the airport code FUN, which feels almost too fitting. Has no fence, no gate, no security perimeter separating it from the town. If you walk along the main road on a Tuesday afternoon, you'll find yourself strolling across the tarmac without a single barrier in your way. Because that same strip of asphalt functions as a road, a soccer field, and a gathering space where families set up plastic chairs as the sun begins to drop. When a plane is incoming, a siren wails across the island. And within a few minutes, residents calmly gather their children, their motorbikes, their folding tables and market stalls, step off the strip, wait for the aircraft to land and taxi past, and then drift right back to exactly what they were doing. You'll notice that nobody panics. Nobody rushes. Nobody treats it as anything more than a mild interruption to the afternoon. The whole thing unfolds with the calm efficiency of a routine performed 1,000 times over. On evenings when no flight is scheduled, the runway becomes something else entirely. Kids appear with worn footballs, marking goalposts with flip-flops and driftwood, while teenagers ride back and forth on motorbikes just to feel the smoothness of the only decent stretch of flat ground for miles. You'll find families spreading mats near the southern end, where the ocean breeze cuts across the tarmac and makes the heat bearable, and where the sky opens up in a way it simply cannot between the tighter streets of the town center. It is not just a runway. It is the closest thing Funafuti has to a public square, a place where the social life of the island concentrates itself against a backdrop of painted markings and landing lights. Interestingly, the entire country has only about 8 kilometers of paved road and no railway whatsoever, which is why motorbikes and walking dominate every aspect of daily movement. If you need to get from one end of Funafuti to the other, you either walk or you ride, and most people do both within the span of a single afternoon. There are no traffic lights, no intersections, no multi-lane highways, just a single paved loop that traces the outline of the atoll, and a network of sandy footpaths branching off toward the lagoon on one side and the ocean on the other. Around 11,000 people live on Funafuti, which is roughly half the country's entire population, and yet you'll rarely see anything resembling congestion. The pace of movement matches the pace of everything else here. Unhurried, practical, shaped by the reality that nowhere on the island is more than a short walk away. But the runway and its rhythm only tell the story of Funafuti itself. For the 8 outer islands, boats are the only connection. Sometimes sailing as infrequently as once a month, which means that food, mail, medical supplies, and visiting relatives all move on the ocean's schedule rather than anyone else's. If you live on one of those outer islands and need to reach the capital, you wait for the next available vessel, and you hope the sea cooperates. That isolation shapes nearly everything about how Tuvalu functions as a nation. Not just the logistics of governance, but the entire texture of daily life on the outer islands, where routines follow daylight and tides rather than fixed schedules. And here's something worth noting about those routines. On the outer islands, the concept of a fixed appointment barely exists. A meeting happens when the tide is right for the boat to arrive. A clinic opens when the nurse finishes her morning catch. A church service might start when the sun drops low enough to make the building bearable. If you come from a place governed by clocks and calendars, the adjustment can feel disorienting at first. But you'll find that the rhythm of the tides is no less reliable than any train schedule, and considerably more honest about its dependencies. And it is on those same waters, surrounding those same islands, that nearly every meal on every dinner table in Tuvalu begins its journey. Eating from the sea, living on the coconut. Fishing supplies most of the food in Tuvalu, and it has for as long as the islands have been inhabited. If you walk to the shore in the early morning, you'll find fishermen pushing wooden canoes into the shallows, reading the wind and the water as naturally as speech. Because out here, those signs are not optional, and they never were. Tuna, parrotfish, and octopus are the staples, caught from the reef and the open ocean with techniques refined over countless generations. There are no industrial trawlers here, no factory ships, no frozen supply chains stretching across continents. Just wooden canoes and inherited knowledge. Interestingly, the second pillar of Tuvaluan survival doesn't come from the ocean at all. The coconut palm is not just a tree, it is an entire livelihood compressed into a single plant. If you watch how a Tuvaluan family uses one, you'll find that almost nothing is wasted. The water inside is drunk, the flesh is grated and pressed for oil, and the husks are dried and burned as fuel. In a place where the coral soil supports almost nothing, the coconut does the work of a grocery store, a pharmacy, and a gas station all at once. One thing that's easy to miss is what lies beneath each island, a lens of freshwater, rainwater filtered through sand and floating above the heavier seawater below. It is fragile, invisible, and absolutely essential. The Tuvaluans learned long ago to dig down to this lens and grow crops in the damp soil. Passing the knowledge through what must be dozens of generations. Pulaka, a root crop grown in island pits, remains a vital staple, though saltwater intrusion from rising seas has been damaging harvests with increasing frequency. A signature dish you'll likely encounter is palusami. Taro leaves baked in coconut cream until they fuse into something rich and faintly sweet. Alongside it, you'll often find fish grilled slowly over a fire fed by dried coconut husks, the smoke lending the flesh a flavor no imported stove could reproduce. And anything not produced locally, from canned goods to rice to fuel, arrives by ship from Fiji or Australia, carrying prices that reflect just how far these islands sit from anywhere else. If you step inside one of the small stores on Funafuti, you'll find shelves lined with canned corned beef, instant noodles, and rice. But the price tags tell a deeper story. A can of tuna that might cost around $1 in Suva runs roughly 3 or 4 times that here. And here's something worth noting. When the next freighter is delayed, the shelves thin out fast. And yet, for a country at the end of so many supply lines, Tuvalu has been quietly building connections of a very different kind. Ones that don't arrive by ship at all. A school, a hospital, and one phone signal. The connections that don't arrive by ship come from space. In January 2025, Starlink internet reached Tuvalu, and satellite dishes began appearing on rooftops across the atolls, pulling signal from low orbit, the way families here have always pulled fish from the surrounding reef. If you walk through Funafuti now, you'll notice the small white discs angled skyward on corrugated tin roofs. Some lash down against the wind with the same care that goes into lashing a canoe. For a country where a single undersea cable was never economically viable and where connection speeds were, until recently, closer to what much of the world experienced in the early 2000s, this is not just an upgrade in bandwidth. It's a redefinition of what isolation means. A teenager on one of the outer islands can now video call a relative in Auckland, stream a lecture from Suva, or upload footage of a fatele ceremony to an audience thousands of kilometers away. And here's something worth noting. This change lands on a population that was already better educated than most outsiders might assume. Education is free through secondary school, with literacy hovering around 99%, a figure that would put Tuvalu ahead of many countries with vastly larger economies. Tuvaluan is taught alongside English from the earliest years. So children grow up bilingual, moving between 2 languages the way they move between the lagoon and the open ocean. The classrooms are modest by any standard. Concrete walls, open windows, ceiling fans turning slowly. But if you visit one, you'll find the instruction serious and the results hard to argue with. Healthcare, by contrast, centers on Princess Margaret Hospital on Funafuti, the only major medical facility in the country. For routine care and basic treatment, it serves the population well enough. But anything beyond its capacity, complex surgery, advanced diagnostics, certain emergencies, gets evacuated to Fiji or New Zealand. On the outer islands, a serious illness isn't just a health concern. It's a question of whether the next plane aligns with the severity of the moment. The country still relies on a single financial institution, the National Bank of Tuvalu, and only got its first ATM in 2025. Before that, cash moved almost entirely through the bank's counters during business hours. And if you needed money on a Sunday or after closing, you simply waited. For a population of roughly 11,000, this was simply how things worked. Children now learn technology alongside traditional skills like reading tides, and the two sit side by side without one pushing the other out. But the deeper story is what happens when you give a highly literate, deeply rooted population a window to the world. You get young people who can navigate a tablet in the morning and read the Reef in the afternoon. And that combination, the digital and the ancestral, held in the same hands, is about to matter in ways nobody on these islands could have imagined, in no small part because of two letters the whole world already recognizes. Two letters that feed a nation. Those two letters are T and V. When the system of country code top-level domains was being assigned to nations around the world, Tuvalu received .tv, a suffix that, by sheer coincidence, matched the abbreviation the entire planet already used for television. If you've ever watched a stream on Twitch, the enormous live streaming platform owned by Amazon, or landed on any of the hundreds of thousands of websites operating under a .tv address, you've already passed through Tuvaluan digital territory without knowing it. The government leases the domain to international registrars, and the licensing revenue that returns reaches around $5 to $15 million every year. That number might not sound remarkable until you place it beside Tuvalu's entire economy, which totals roughly $60 to $65 million. Two letters, generating as much as a quarter of everything this country produces. What makes this unusual is that most country code domains carry no commercial weight at all. Tajikistan's .tj, Turkmenistan's .tm, Tonga's .tod. These suffixes exist, but nobody outside a handful of specialists ever thinks about them. For Tuvalu, the outcome was entirely different. Entertainment companies, gaming platforms, and media startups all wanted a web address that signaled video content before a visitor even clicked through. The demand created a steady licensing market, and the revenue that flows back to Funafuti, Tuvalu's capital, has become indispensable to the national budget. You'll find that the entire arrangement runs quietly, invisible to the millions of people who type those two letters every day. And here's something worth noting. Tuvalu didn't simply spend the money as it came in. In 1987, together with the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, the government established the Tuvalu Trust Fund, a sovereign investment vehicle designed to convert unpredictable revenue into long-term stability. Over the decades, through careful management, that fund has grown to about 256 million Australian dollars, a sum that, for a country this size, dwarfs its annual economic output several times over. Not just a reserve, a financial cushion built to outlast whatever comes next. Beyond the digital economy, Tuvalu draws income from something far older than the internet. The country's exclusive economic zone spans roughly 900,000 square kilometers of open ocean, an expanse of water so vast it dwarfs the 9 tiny islands themselves. Within those waters, tuna migrate in enormous schools, and the licenses to pursue them have become one of Tuvalu's steadiest sources of income. Fleets from Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, and the United States pay for the right to operate there, their industrial vessels harvesting skipjack and yellowfin tuna that eventually surface on supermarket shelves and restaurant menus half a world away. If you've ever opened a can of tuna in Europe or ordered ahi in a Tokyo restaurant, there's a reasonable chance the fish began its journey in waters that belong to a nation of around 11,000 people. The ocean has always fed these islands. Now, through licensing, it feeds the national budget as well. But even the most carefully managed fund has its limits. The trust was built to secure Tuvalu's future. The real question is whether the land beneath that future will still exist. When the sea rises, a nation refuses to disappear. Sea levels around Tuvalu are rising at roughly 1.5 times the global average, which means that what most of the world experiences as a distant, almost theoretical trend, Tuvalu encounters as water pooling in yards and creeping into the pits where families grow their staple crops. It was this reality that Tuvalu's then Foreign Minister, Simon Kofe, chose to put before the world at the 2021 COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow. Rather than standing at a lectern inside a conference hall, he recorded his address standing in the ocean itself, the seawater rising past his knees at a spot on Funafuti that had once been dry ground. If you watch the footage, you'll notice that the water is calm, even gentle, which somehow makes the sight more unsettling than any storm could. There is something about a man in a suit and tie addressing the United Nations from inside the sea that no chart or projection can replicate. It was not just a political statement. It was a portrait of what extinction looks like while it is still happening. And here's something that complicates the story. A 2018 Auckland University study found that Tuvalu's total land area had actually grown by about 2.9% since 1971, as tides and storms shifted sand and coral rubble across the atolls. However, the same study acknowledged that salinity and flooding still threaten livability, even where the land itself has not disappeared. Rising seas can add sand to a shoreline and poison the fresh water beneath it in the same season. And it is livability, not raw acreage, that decides whether a place can still be called home. Then there is the question of the people themselves. Under the Whalepili Treaty with Australia, active since around August 2024, roughly 280 Tuvaluans are permitted to migrate each year through a ballot system. When the first round opened, over 8,750 people registered, a figure that, for a nation of around 11,000, is almost staggering to contemplate. The very first citizens under the scheme began settling in Australia in late 2025, and a second ballot opened in 2026. That's not just an immigration agreement. It is a government formally acknowledging that the ground beneath its citizens may not hold. And yet the treaty caps the number at 280, which means that even among those who registered, the vast majority will stay exactly where they are. But Tuvalu is not simply waiting to vanish. A 2023 constitutional amendment declared that the nation's statehood would endure permanently, regardless of any future loss of physical territory. A legal foundation almost without precedent, a country asserting that it will remain a country even if the map no longer shows its land. Alongside it, a digital nation project unveiled at the COP27 summit is already underway to preserve the country's culture, language, and government records in virtual form, so that the state can keep functioning even in exile. And here is what most outsiders never hear. Tuvalu is fighting for the physical ground at the very same time. Through the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project, engineers have been dredging sand from the lagoon and pumping it ashore to build raised, reclaimed land on Funafuti. New ground, deliberately elevated to stay above projected sea levels beyond the year 2100. The first stretch, nearly 8 hectares of it, is already complete on the same island where the foreign minister once stood knee-deep in the tide, and a second phase is extending the protection further along the shoreline. Undersea cable and connectivity projects are being pursued in parallel. It is a two-front strategy that would sound almost contradictory anywhere else, preparing for the worst-case scenario of total loss, while simultaneously refusing to let the land go without a fight. The treaty with Australia has opened a door. What happens when people are asked to walk through it is a question that cuts deeper than any policy can answer. The sea will keep rising. The ballot to Australia is open. The reclaimed land is being built. The digital nation is taking shape. Every safeguard a tiny country could invent is already in motion. And still, ask most Tuvaluans if they'll leave, and the answer is no. Not out of stubbornness, but because everything that makes them who they are, the ancestors buried in this coral, the songs of the Fatele, the language itself, lives here and nowhere else. They would rather defend a home that may not outlast them than arrive somewhere safe with nothing left to say. The ocean may get the final word. The choice to stay belongs to them. So here's my question for you. If your homeland were slowly disappearing, would you stay and fight for it, or leave to start again? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.